Sheriff Elias Thorne didn't just wear the badge, he wore his authority like a suit of armor, tight and unforgiving. To him, the county roads weren't just pavement, they were his private domain. That was why, when he saw the rusted, shuddering frame of a 1950s tractor hogging the shoulder of the state highway, his blood began to boil. The farmer behind the wheel, an elderly man named Arthur with a hat worn thin by decades of sun, didn't look like a threat, he looked like an obstacle to progress. Thorne didn't pull over to help. He pulled over to make an example, unaware that he was about to sign his own professional death warrant. The scene was set against the backdrop of a midsummer afternoon, where the heat waves shimmered off the asphalt, distorting the horizon into a liquid haze. Sheriff Thorne's cruiser, a black and white behemoth equipped with the latest speed tracking technology and a siren that could wake the dead, screeched to a halt behind the aging John Deere. The tractor was a relic, a stubborn piece of machinery that seemed to belong in a museum rather than on a high-speed thoroughfare. It wheezed, emitting a rhythmic, metallic clatter that sounded like a dying breath, yet it moved with a strange, defiant persistence. Thorne stepped out of his vehicle, his boots crunching loudly on the dry gravel of the shoulder. He adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of his sidearm, and fixed his sunglasses. He wasn't just annoyed, he felt personally insulted by the audacity of this machine. In his mind, roads like this were for efficiency, for modern commerce, and for people who understood the hierarchy of law and order. A slow-moving tractor was a disruption, a middle finger to the efficiency he prided himself on maintaining in his county. As he walked toward the tractor, he didn't see a man, he saw a nuisance. He saw a project for a citation, a way to flex his muscle and remind the locals who truly governed these hills. Arthur, the farmer, didn't move quickly. He didn't jump off the seat in a panic as Thorne approached. He simply slowed the tractor to a stop, the engine vibrating through the earth, and turned his head slowly. His face was a map of lines and hard work, his eyes cloudy with age but sharp with an unreadable depth. "You have any idea what kind of backup you're causing, old man?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. He didn't wait for an answer. He began to circle the machine, his hand grazing the rusted metal, picking up flakes of orange-brown oxidation that stained his palm. "This thing belongs in a scrap yard, not on a state road. It's a safety hazard. It's a public nuisance. Honestly, I'm surprised it even starts, let alone manages to crawl out of your driveway." Arthur remained silent, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. The contrast between the two men was stark, Thorne, polished, aggressive, and impatient, and Arthur, weathered, immovable, and oddly tranquil. The sheriff continued his verbal assault, feeling the rush of power that came from belittling someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, fight back. He started listing off hypothetical violations, obstructed view, improper lighting, engine emissions, and impeding traffic flow. He was building a case out of thin air, a legal house of cards designed to humiliate the farmer and force him off the road forever. "I'm going to need to see your registration and proof of ownership," Thorne demanded, extending his hand with a sharp snap of his wrist. "And let me guess, you probably don't even have it, do you? Probably bought this off some other relic 10 years ago without a bill of sale." Arthur finally shifted. He reached into a worn leather pouch attached to the side of the tractor's hood. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, almost as if he were savoring the moment. He pulled out a yellowed, plastic-wrapped document. It wasn't the standard, modern registration slip Thorne expected. It looked older, heavier. When Arthur handed it over, he didn't apologize. He didn't beg for leniency. He simply watched the sheriff with an expression that Thorne would later struggle to define, a mixture of pity and warning. Thorne snatched the paper, his eyes darting across the text. He expected to find a mismatch, a clerical error, or perhaps an expired document from 3 decades ago. He was ready to write a citation that would bury the old man in fines. But as he looked at the official stamp on the bottom of the page, his brow furrowed. There was a signature there, a seal he recognized but hadn't seen in years. It wasn't a standard DMV issue. It was something else, something that suggested this machine wasn't just farm equipment. The realization didn't hit him all at once. It started as a gnawing feeling in the back of his mind, a dissonance between the rusty, broken-down exterior of the tractor and the heavy, official weight of the paperwork in his hand. He looked back at the tractor, really looking at it this time. Beneath the grime, there were markings. Not brand labels, but government stencils, faded and painted over, but still visible if one knew where to look. "What is this?" Thorne muttered, more to himself than to Arthur. Arthur just smiled. It was a thin, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's exactly what it says it is, Sheriff. And I suggest you read it very carefully before you decide to write that ticket." Thorne stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in his grip, though he quickly steeled himself, refusing to let the old man see his hesitation. He wasn't one to be intimidated by a piece of paper, no matter how official it looked. He was the sheriff, he held the power in this county, and he had spent his entire career ensuring that nobody, regardless of their status or history, challenged that authority. He tucked the paper into his breast pocket, tapping it twice with a sense of feigned nonchalance. "I'll be verifying this," Thorne said, his voice regaining its sharp, authoritarian edge. "In the meantime, you're off the road. I'm impounding this eyesore until I can determine why a piece of equipment with irregular markings is currently operating on a public highway." Arthur didn't argue. He simply killed the engine, the sudden silence in the field feeling heavier than the noise had been. He climbed down from the tractor with a grace that belied his age, his boots hitting the dirt with a thud. He moved to the side of the road and sat on a nearby fence post, folding his arms across his chest. He didn't look like a man who had just had his livelihood taken away, he looked like a man who was watching a storm approach that only he could see. Thorne called for a flatbed tow truck, barking orders over his radio with a frantic energy. He needed this to be quick. He needed to be rid of the tractor, rid of the old man, and back in his office where he could examine the records without the weight of Arthur's unblinking stare. As the tow truck arrived, the driver, a local named Miller who had known Arthur for years, looked visibly uncomfortable. "Sheriff," Miller said, eyeing the tractor cautiously, "you sure about this? That's Arthur's rig. He's been using that thing to plow the north field since before you were even born. Never had a lick of trouble with it." "The law doesn't care about history, Miller. The law cares about compliance," Thorne snapped, pointing toward the back of the flatbed. "Load it up. And be careful, it's now evidence in an investigation regarding potential tampering with government property." Miller hesitated, but he knew Thorne's temper. He winced as the chains clinked against the aged steel of the tractor, the sound echoing like a knell through the quiet afternoon. As they secured the machine, Arthur stood up from the fence post. He walked over to Thorne, his shadow stretching long and thin across the gravel. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Arthur said, his voice low and steady. "You think you're enforcing the law, but you're just pulling at a thread. Once you pull that thread, you're not going to like what starts unraveling." Thorne laughed, a sharp, barking sound that held no humor. "Save the cryptic warnings for your grandkids, Arthur. I'm just doing my job." As the tow truck pulled away, carrying the tractor toward the local impound lot, a fenced-in patch of land behind the station, Thorne felt a surge of triumph. He felt he had reasserted control over his territory. But as he drove back to his office, he couldn't stop looking at the rearview mirror, checking to see if Arthur was still standing there. The old man was still on the shoulder, a small, dark silhouette against the vast, golden field, watching the truck disappear. Back at the station, Thorne didn't go to his desk. He went straight to the impound lot. He walked around the tractor, his flashlight cutting through the dimming evening light. Up close, without the glare of the sun, the markings were even more pronounced. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped away a thick layer of grease from the frame near the rear axle. Beneath the grime, he found a serial number. It wasn't the standard John Deere alphanumeric code. It was a military-grade identifier, followed by a series of codes he hadn't seen since his academy days, and even then, only in classified textbooks. His heart began to race. He pulled the document from his pocket again, holding it under the light of his flashlight. The seal wasn't just official, it was archaic, dating back to a branch of the federal government that had been reorganized or dissolved decades ago. His mind began to spin. Was this stolen? Was it a black market project? Or was it something else entirely, something that Arthur, a simple farmer, had no business possessing? He walked inside, his boots echoing in the quiet station. He sat at his computer. But instead of logging into the standard DMV database, he hesitated. He remembered the warnings about pulling the thread. He thought of the way Arthur had looked at him, not with fear, but with a terrifying, calm certainty. Thorne reached for his phone, intending to call a contact at the state level to run the serial number, but then he paused. If this was really government-related, if this was what he feared it might be, calling the wrong person could end his career before it even started. He realized he was in deeper than he had planned. The arrogance that had fueled him on the highway began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, prickling sensation of unease. He was no longer the hunter, he felt like a man who had stumbled into a trap that had been set a long time ago. He decided to run the plates through a private database he kept for unofficial inquiries. It was a tool he used to dig up dirt on local politicians or business owners, a digital skeleton key. As the search results loaded, the screen flickered, casting a blue hue over his face. He leaned in, his breath hitching. The file associated with that serial number wasn't just restricted, it was classified. The screen displayed a single, flashing red warning, unauthorized access detected, logging initiated. Thorne's stomach dropped. He slammed the laptop shut, the sudden silence of the office now suffocating. His hands were shaking. In his entire career, he had never seen a terminal trigger a flag like that. He had searched for petty criminals, corrupt developers, and small-time thieves, but he had never poked at a hornet's nest that could bite back with this level of automated fury. He sat in the dark for a long time, the hum of the refrigerator in the break room sounding like a rhythmic ticking clock. He realized then that the tractor wasn't just a piece of farm machinery. It was a Trojan horse. By impounding it, he hadn't just inconvenienced an old man, he had triggered an alarm. He had physically brought an object of extreme interest onto his own property, essentially labeling his police station as the host for a mystery he was woefully unprepared to solve. Thorne stood up and paced the small office. He needed to get rid of the tractor, but he knew it was too late. He had already logged the impoundment in the official county records. If he moved it now without a trail, he would be guilty of tampering with evidence. If he left it there, he was sitting on a ticking time bomb. The audacity of Arthur, a man who looked like he spent his days nursing bad knees and watching the clouds, now appeared in a different light. This wasn't a farmer. This was someone who had spent decades waiting for a moment like this, perhaps even inviting it. He returned to his desk and reopened the laptop, this time using a proxy server to mask his identity. He had to know what the serial number represented. He didn't search for ownership, he searched for procurement. The results were cryptic, appearing as redacted PDFs and fragmented ledger entries from the late 1960s. The tractor, or at least the chassis identified by that number, had been part of a decommissioned research project in the high desert. It was a prototype. And according to the files, it should have been destroyed in 1974. Thorne felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. Why would an elderly farmer have a prototype that was officially listed as incinerated over 50 years ago? He scrolled through the pages, his eyes straining in the dim light. There were names attached to the project, names that Thorne recognized from local history books, people who had owned vast swathes of land in the county before the economic collapse of the 90s. These were the people who had built the town, the founders whose statues stood in the park, the families who held the keys to the local bank. Arthur's name wasn't on the list, but a name he recognized from the neighboring property was Vance. It was the same family that owned the land where the modern highway now sat, the very road where Thorne had pulled Arthur over. The pieces began to click into place, but they didn't form a picture that made sense. They formed a warning. This tractor was a mobile piece of history, a physical artifact that proved a deal had been made, a deal involving land rights, government subsidies, and a massive cover-up of environmental or perhaps even mineral assets. The broken-down tractor was actually a symbol of leverage. As long as Arthur was driving it on that road, he was occupying territory that he likely held a pre-existing claim to, a claim that superseded the state's current zoning laws. Thorne realized he had been played. Arthur hadn't been driving the tractor because he was an old man with nowhere else to go. He had been driving it to create a jurisdictional conflict. He had been baiting Thorne, waiting for an overzealous lawman to provide the catalyst needed to bring the issue into the court system, a system where the ownership records would finally be scrutinized. The sheriff pulled the original document Arthur had given him from his pocket. He turned it over, examining the watermark under the desk lamp. It wasn't just paper, it was a land grant, an original deed that predated the county's incorporation. It granted the holder exclusive access and usage rights to the valley, regardless of current infrastructure or public road status. If this document was legitimate, the state's claim to that section of the highway was legally compromised. Thorne felt a wave of nausea. He was a small-town sheriff, and he had just stepped into a high-stakes legal war between the state and a private citizen with the receipts to back up his claim. He looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. He knew he couldn't stay here. But he also knew he couldn't leave. He had to talk to Arthur. He had to know what the endgame was. He grabbed his keys and headed back out to the lot. The night air was crisp, the crickets providing a steady, monotonous soundtrack. He walked toward the tractor, his flashlight beam wavering. As he approached, he saw something that made him freeze. The lock on the gate to the impound lot had been cut. It wasn't cut with bolt cutters. The steel had been sheared through with surgical precision. And the tractor? It was still there, but it wasn't the same. The engine cover had been removed, and the interior components, the very things that looked like archaic farming tech, were now exposed. They weren't engine parts. They were intricate, glowing interfaces, humming with a low-frequency vibration that Thorne could feel in his teeth. He stepped back, his hand instinctively going to his holstered weapon. This wasn't a tractor. It was something else, a piece of technology hidden in plain sight, disguised as a relic to keep it buried in the past. And Arthur? He was nowhere to be seen, but Thorne could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the darkness near the barn. Thorne's breath hitched in his throat. The rhythmic tapping wasn't just noise, it was code. Every strike against the wooden post of the barn was deliberate, a metallic ping that resonated with a frequency he didn't understand but instinctively feared. He pulled his flashlight up, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the area around the tractor. The ground was littered with small, metallic fragments that looked like microscopic circuit boards, cooling rapidly in the night air. "You really should have left it alone, Elias," a voice called out from the shadows. Thorne spun around, his weapon leveled at the darkness. Arthur stepped into the beam of light. He wasn't the hunched-over farmer he had been on the roadside. He stood taller now, his shoulders squared. His eyes reflecting the blue glow emanating from the tractor's exposed core. He held a small, handheld device that flickered with the same light, a remote override that had clearly deactivated the lot's security systems without so much as a blip. "Who are you?" Thorne managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this thing?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the tractor, his movements fluid and precise. "This machine has been the silent guardian of this valley for 70 years. It isn't a tractor, and it never was. It's an archival unit, a collection point for geological data that this county, and the corporations backing it, have spent decades trying to suppress. When you impounded it, you didn't just break the law, you triggered a broadcast sequence. The local grid, the satellite uplink, every digital archive in this district, they're currently being overwritten with the truth." Thorne lowered his weapon, his mind reeling. "You're talking about a conspiracy. That's insane. I'm calling for backup." Arthur laughed, a hollow sound. "By all means. Call them. Tell them you found the junker. Tell them you've opened the box. But be warned, the moment you signal dispatch, the verification will hit their screens. And when it does, the people you work for won't be coming to help you. They'll be coming to erase the site, and anyone who saw what was inside." Thorne's radio crackled to life, static flooding the air. A distorted voice pushed through the interference. "Dispatch to Unit 101. Sheriff Thorne, confirm your status. We are receiving high-priority telemetry alerts from your location. Unauthorized decryption detected. Identify the source." Thorne looked at the radio, then back at Arthur. He realized the old man was telling the truth. The records weren't just deeds, they were keys to a digital lock. By impounding the tractor, Thorne had inadvertently provided the bridge needed to transmit the hidden history of the valley onto the public record. The sheriff's station, the most secure building in the county, was now the source of a massive, unstoppable data leak. "Why me?" Thorne asked, his voice cracking. "Why choose me to pull over?" "Because you were the loudest," Arthur replied calmly. "I needed someone with enough authority to create a paper trail, but enough arrogance to bypass the standard protocols. I needed a sheriff who wouldn't just verify the records, I needed one who would try to bury them. The moment you logged this in your system, the encryption broke. Thank you for your service, Sheriff." Thorne felt the weight of his badge. It suddenly felt like a brand of shame. All his life, he had prided himself on being the ultimate authority, the man who knew everything that happened on his roads. Now, he realized he had been nothing more than a pawn in a game played by men far more dangerous and intelligent than he could ever be. He thought of his career, his pension, his standing in the community. It was all gone. If the truth came out, if the archives were exposed, the entire foundation of the town's economy, the mining deals, the land grabs, the legal road expansions, would be revealed as a criminal enterprise. He would be the face of that discovery, the man who had officially initiated the investigation that brought the whole house of cards crashing down. "You destroyed my life," Thorne whispered, staring at the glowing engine block. "No," Arthur corrected, turning back to the tractor. "I gave you an out. You can walk away now, go home, and pretend you never saw me. Or, you can stand here, take credit for a discovery you didn't understand, and face the consequences when the real owners of this valley come to collect their due. The choice is yours, Sheriff. But the broadcast is already at 90%. Thorne looked at the gate. He could run. He could leave his cruiser, his badge, and his life behind and disappear into the hills. Or, he could stay and witness the end of an era. He looked at the tractor, the machine that had been the butt of his jokes only hours ago. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, a relic of a time when secrets were kept with physical locks and heavy iron, now unleashed into the digital ether. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge, and stared at it. The emblem of the county, the star he had polished every morning for 10 years. He let it drop to the gravel. It landed with a dull, final thud. What happens when it reaches 100%? Thorne asked. The world finally gets to see what's beneath the asphalt, Arthur said, reaching out to touch the tractor's console. The light intensified, turning from a soft blue to a brilliant, blinding white. And trust me, Sheriff, nothing you've ever done on these roads will matter compared to what happens next. The light didn't just illuminate the impound lot, it seemed to consume it. The white glow pulsed, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made the very air feel thick, like walking through water. Thorne shielded his eyes, staggering back against the cold metal fence. The station, the trees, the patrol car, everything looked distorted, as if seen through the lens of a camera that had lost its focus. He watched as the data, visualized as streams of flickering, alphanumeric code, danced in the air around the tractor, flowing upward toward the sky like a digital aurora. Arthur stood in the epicenter, his hands resting on the exposed console. He looked different now, not older, but ageless. The farmer's attire seemed to fall away, replaced by the quiet authority of a man who had completed a mission decades in the making. He didn't look back at Thorne. He remained fixed on the task. His fingers dancing over interfaces that shouldn't have existed. The records, Thorne shouted over the rising hum, his voice thin and fragile. What did they actually hide? What was worth all this? Arthur's voice didn't come from his throat, it seemed to resonate from everywhere, a calm, steady projection. The valley was never meant to be a town, Elias. It was a repository. A vault of history, of technology, and of truth that was supposed to be protected, not paved over for suburban development and tax schemes. The people who built this county, the founders you respect so much, they didn't buy the land. They stole it from the future. They buried the past beneath miles of asphalt and forgotten regulations, hoping that time would erase the evidence. They thought if they kept it simple, kept it mundane, no one would ever look twice. Thorne fell to his knees. The weight of his own insignificance was crushing. He had spent his life enforcing the laws of a system that was built on a foundation of lies, a system that had used him as a useful idiot. Every ticket he wrote, every citizen he bullied, every road he patrolled, it was all for the benefit of a machine that cared nothing for the law. And now? Thorne asked, his voice shaking. Now, the truth is public, Arthur said. The broadcast has reached every terminal, every server, and every handheld device within 100 miles. The documents, the deeds, the original land grants, and the evidence of the systematic cover-ups, it's all being indexed by the world's most inquisitive minds as we speak. By morning, the state will be scrambling. By next week, the lawsuits will start. And the tractor? It's just the vessel. The secret is out, and it can never be buried again. As if on cue, the hum reached a crescendo and then snapped into absolute silence. The blinding white light vanished, leaving the lot in darkness, save for the hum of the overhead security lamps that had flickered back to life. It was the only thing left of the secret, the only piece of the junker that he had taken with him. He closed his hand around it, feeling the weight. The sheriff who mocked an old farmer had been replaced by a man who now held the key to the town's past. He realized then that Arthur hadn't destroyed his life, he had given him the only thing that mattered in a world of lies, the truth. And as the first light of dawn touched the asphalt, Thorne smiled. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of it. He was finally on the right side of the law of history, which always, eventually, reveals the truth.